In this video, we're going to implement the login form. So I'm going to open login.js and I'm going to bring in the same dependencies that we used for the registration. So it's React and component from React, mutation and GQL as well. Okay, so we can now create a mutation for logging in the user using this template literal tag, and I'm going to call that login, and the login needs two variables, right? There's a username, which is a string, and there's a password, which is a string as well. And now we can call our mutation passing in the username and the passwords as well. And remember, the login actually, I don't know how I managed to type that. Okay, so the login mutation returns us a token. So that's what we will expect. We'll expect a token to be returned. And in a very similar way to how the registration form worked, we are going to create a class here and call that login form that extends the component. And we will add the login form component right after the h2 element in here. Okay, so the login form will have a state as well, whereby we have the username set to be an empty string and the password to be an empty string as well. And I'm going to have the same methods or some similar methods to what we had in the registration form. So username changed, says the state, so does password changed. Now we'll need a render method as well. And that is going to return something. Now what are we going to return here? Well, we're going to return a mutation again, where we call the login user mutation. And once we call that, we will have access to the login mutation itself, and then the loading and error states. And what we will do is return a form again. So this form will have an onSubmit call, and we're going to create a function now called submit form, where I'm going to pass in the event and the login mutation. So this is our form. And what I'm going to do is something what I've done earlier. Again, just copy some code from a pre-written example that I have. So it's the username and the password. So exactly the same stuff that we did for the registration. And I'm also going to add the button here. And in fact, I'm going to add this disabled attribute already. So if the form is not valid, then the button should be disabled. And I'm going to add login here. And of course, we need to write this valid form functionality, which I'm going to do just before in the return statement in the render. So we can save this. Let's take a look at register. Login. So let's click on login. Okay, so the basic functionality is there, so I can use the disabled attribute. Excellent. So what we need to do now is, of course, write the submit form function. So what happens when we submit this form? So let's create the actual function, submit form. We passed in an event and the login mutation itself. And let's think about what should this particular form do. First of all, it should prevent the default behavior on the event. And then it should call the login mutation. And this is exactly the same that we've done for registration, except now I extract the function call into its own function. So we need to pass in the variables, and the variables are the username from the state and the password from the state of the component as well. Okay, so once we log in, then we will have access to some data. For now, I'm just going to log the data. So what is the data in this case? The data in this case should be the token itself. And let's log out any potential errors. Now I'm just logging the errors to the console. In a proper application, we could take the error messages and display that in the user interface as well, of course. So let's save this and see if this works. Now remember, we don't need to do anything special here because all the functionality for the login is taken care of by the GraphQL application that we created earlier, right? So we just need to send a username and a password, and GraphQL should take care of everything. So let's hit login, and what we get back is an object that has a token, and that looks like a JSON web token to me. So that means that the login worked. Now let's mess up this password, and in that case what we get is the password is incorrect message. So probably we could take that error and print it somewhere here in the interface. I leave that for you as a homework to do. Okay, so what do we do next? We have the token. So there are a few steps that we will need to take in order to make sure that this login works. So when you work with JSON Web Tokens, I think I've mentioned that before, that the tokens themselves will need to be stored somewhere. They are either stored in a cookie or in local storage. You can see local storage right here, and as you can see, this is empty. So what we're going to do is that if the login is successful, so in this part of our code, instead of logging the data, we're going to store it in local storage. And we don't need to bring in any library. We can just type in local storage.setItem. That requires us to specify a key and a value, right? So the local storage is a key value pair. You can see it in this table as well. So the key is going to be token, or you can call it whatever you want. I'm just going to stick with token for now, and the value is going to be data.login.token, so the actual token value. So let's save this. Enter a valid username and password combination. So I'm using a user that I've registered earlier, and if we hit login, notice that the token key was added to the local storage. So that's one step that we want to do, and this is great so far. Now the second step that we want to do is probably redirect the user to the profile, right? Because we want to make sure that if someone logs in, we add the token, we have valid token, they should automatically be redirected to their profile page. So in light of that, what I'm going to do is create the profile page, at least the shell of that component. So I'm going to bring in the component from React, and that's component. Let's create a profile page which is going to return a div, and it's going to return a profile which I'm going to create right now. It extends the component, and to have a render method that is going to return a div, and in here I'm just going to say h2 and hello again, and then we want to have the name of the logged in user in here. So we're going to build out this functionality as we progress, but let's now export the default profile page. And because we added this profile page, we also need to add this to our router. And where's our router? Where it's in app.js. So we need to create a new path and call this profile, and we need to bring in the profile page. Okay, so now what we have, if you go to profile, is this profile page that says hello again. And this of course has a few issues, because first of all, when we log in and we set the token, we want to redirect the user to that profile page. So let's take a look at that. How do we do that? Well, ideally we would want to call the redirection of the browser, right? So we want to add, or we want to push a new route to the browser history. So how do we do that? Well, we need to make a few modifications in here in login.js. And the first modification is that we need to bring in with router from the React router DOM. And what we need to do, we need to wrap the login page with router. So instead of saying export default login page, we need to say export default with router login page. So what are we doing here? What you see here is what React refers to as higher order components. Sometimes you will see this abbreviated to be HOC. And this is an advanced technique in React for reusing a component's logic. So what happens is that basically you enhance an already existing component. So our existing component is the login page, and what we enhance it with is this with router. So you're probably wondering, okay, so what does this with router component do? So with router allows us to access the history object's properties for the closest route match. So this means that if we wrap the login page with router, we will have access to the browser history object, which will also mean that we'll be very easily be able to push a new route to this browser history. But there's a few changes that we need to make, because what we want to do is not only make this login page a higher order component, but to use that history object as well. So how do we do that? Well, because we've wrapped this login page as a higher order component, we can now extract the history object as well, and we can pass that on as a property to our login form. So I'm going to pass the history object as a property to the login form, and because I've done that, I can now very easily access the history property. So as a next step, I want to say this.props, and one property that we added was the history property, and now that allows us to call push and to push onto the profile, or push the profile component to the browser's history. So what this will mean is that if we hit login, we get redirected to the profile component. Now, as you can see, this profile component is very empty because it just says hello again, and we'll need to make sure that we extract the name from a section, and there's a lot of additional work to do, but at least the basic is there. We set the token to be part of the local storage, and then we redirect the user to /profile. So in the next video, we'll build out the profile and make some additional changes to this mini application that we're building so that it functions a lot better.